So hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on a new approach and lessons learned on co-creation, shared spaces, and diversity, and how that can improve water monitoring design. So this is the fifth webinar in the Lake Futures webinar series, and our second webinar this September. My name is Nancy Gaucher, and I'm a knowledge mobilization specialist with Global Water Futures based at the University of Waterloo's Water Institute. But I'm joining you here in my home today, like many of you. I'm also joined by my colleague, Kirsten Grant. She's the project manager at Lake Futures, so feel free to connect with her on the chat if you're having any technical problems or if you have any questions. I want to start by acknowledging that we are participating today from traditional territories of First Peoples across the country. So here in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I am, I acknowledge that I'm on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. The Haldimand Tract is within the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I would like to acknowledge you to also take a moment to recognize the traditional land where you are. So today's, next slide please, Elaine. Today's event is being hosted by Lake Futures, which is a project based out of the University of Waterloo and led by Dr. Nandita Basu, who you heard from a couple weeks ago. The project involves over 20 different researchers from 4 universities. So Lake Futures is a 7-year-long multidisciplinary project that aims to deliver adaptive watershed and lake management solutions that minimize the trade-offs between ecosystems, water uses, and economic growth. As we finish up year 3 of the project, we decided to create this webinar series to connect our findings with external practitioners and other researchers. The goal of this series is to share our latest research findings, to discuss implications for the research and how they might inform water policies and programs and plans in Ontario, and also to promote dialogue between researchers and partners and stakeholders to inform the next phase of our research program. Lake Futures is a project under Global Water Futures, which is the world's largest university-led water research program, with the goal of delivering risk management solutions for managing water in Canada and other cold regions in the world, informed by leading edge water science. Next slide. I will go through a couple quick logistics before we get to the presentation. So please use the Q&A feature to post all questions. This is going to be easier for us to keep track of the questions as they come in. There's also a chat box that you'll see. Use the chat box to share sort of general comments or ideas, or if you want to have dialogue between the participants. And we're also recording this webinar, which will be made available for later for viewing. So today's format, we're going to begin with a presentation from Elaine Ho, followed by the Q&A. And we're really hoping that this can be a two-way conversation, which we recognize is difficult when you're on a webinar. But as the presentation flows, we really encourage you to share your thoughts. And like I said, you can do that through the chat box. And feel free to ask any questions at any point through the Q&A, which we'll get to at the end. So before we get going, we just wanted to do a quick poll. We're wondering who's on the line with us. So let us know which organization best represents where you're coming from. So is that government, non-government, academic, maybe it's industry? If there's an other, please feel free to let us know what other organization you're from in the chat box. We'll give you guys a moment to fill that out, and then we'll take a look at the results. So it looks like we've got a really great combination here. We've got about equal representation from government and academic, but also a good number of people from the NGO world and a few others as well. So that's really great. Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Elaine Ho is a PhD candidate with social and ecological sustainability in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She's a member of the Water Institute, which is based at the University of Waterloo, and a student in the Canadian Rivers Institute, which is based in the University of New Brunswick. Elaine won the Our Water, Our Life, the Most Valuable Resource Award from the Canadian Water Resource Association in May 2019 for her research that's being presented today. And in addition, both Elaine and the Indigenous Youth Project that she'll describe have been nominated for Canada Clean 50 Awards. So from there, I will ask Elaine to take it from here.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a really quick note to say that there's a lot of content that's going to be introduced in this webinar, and for that reason, it will just be introduced. I'm not delving very deeply into too many of the concepts, but feel free to follow up with me. And a lot of my contacts that I've made throughout this research are really eager to communicate with other folks as well and share the work that they do. So feel free to ask if you'd like to connect with someone for one of the projects as well. And this is just a photo of some of the youth that I worked with for that Indigenous youth project that Nancy just mentioned, and we'll get more into that in a few slides. So to start with, just a quick look at what some of the issues are that I set out to try and tackle. One being, as many of us know, there are very siloed, we have a very siloed organization of our institutions, and they don't change very much. So we have a lot of the same structures in place that we did when we first organized our government for natural resource management about a century ago. There's an elitist attitude carried by a lot of people. So a lot of the decision makers are still middle-aged, white, often male, Canadian culture. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes a bad thing when you don't engage with people who represent other perspectives as well, which often is not the case. And of course, over the last 40 years across the country, not just here in Ontario, monitoring capacity has been decreased significantly, primarily through funding, but that of course has many other ripple effects, which also in turn decreases the quality of information that sometimes gets produced, and so diminishes the connection between monitoring and decision making. And so the research goal was to develop a monitoring framework, and the key point here is it's a framework, not an actual program, that considers cumulative effects, is co-created by diverse stakeholders, and that connects monitoring to the broader river or lake management decisions. Cumulative effects is just defined very simply. I'm going to define it here as interacting and aggregating or synergistic impacts that happen over time in a given area that collectively show us an effect that maybe you wouldn't otherwise see if you were looking at things independently. So a high-level methodology, we started with an exploratory study in the Muskoka River watershed in 2016. There was a paper we published in 2018. We did a workshop with them and reviewed their monitoring and communication strategies. The workshop was focused on selecting monitoring indicators that would reduce the number of indicators being monitored or being reported on, because there were too many and they were changing from report card to report card, and it wasn't telling an actual story between each one. Then I spent about 8 months beginning a relationship with key contacts on reserve at the local Indigenous Reserve, which is the Six Nations of the Grand River. At which time I also began doing a monitoring review. So I spoke with some key informants for my interviews, as well as consulted with various individuals, academics, and in government, and people who do monitoring, to try and identify some programs that people felt were strong, and then to do a review on them to see what was commonly done well and what was not done so well. Participant observation included going to water management meetings at the Grand River Conservation Authority, that's a local conservation authority group. And also we led a workshop at the Canadian Water Resources Association National Conference in 2019. That workshop had a lot of academics as well as practitioners, people from the conservation authorities as well as the ministries. And no one in the room, there were about 40 people, had ever done a stakeholder mapping exercise or analysis exercise in the whole role that they've ever had in monitoring. And so no one had really ever looked at who's involved and what the relationships were and where all the relationships seemed to point to and things like this. So it was an interesting but also really challenging exercise for them. Key informant interviews occurred in 2019, and public engagement through Great Art for Great Lakes was also later on in 2019. That's a program that engages about 1,000 Canadian members of the public in community arts projects that would then be installed permanently in the community, but which were themed around Lake Erie. So there would be scientists and people coming out and doing a little bit of public education and talking about what people care about. Then the Indigenous youth engagement, I'll get more into in a few slides. I've got a slide dedicated to that. And as well, we have 2 upcoming workshops, one on October 5th that is going to go more into the framework that's going to be presented here to look at how it needs to change, how to make it feasible, how it can be implemented, as well as a final workshop in mid-November to look at what kind of monitoring indicators can contribute to measuring cumulative effects. So if you're interested in either of those, they're open for invitation. So from our exploratory research, I'm not going to go really too deep into this. This is from the paper that we published. It's linked later on in the slides, which you'll have a copy of. The main idea here is you do have the basic process where people will come in and say, well, what are the priority areas? And then what are the things that we can measure to tell us what's going on with these priority areas? However, this process was designed to shortlist those indicators in times of reduced capacity. But that little section that I've just highlighted can also be applied for the original selection of indicators as well. And what the main idea here is to use a variety of criteria. These are examples of criteria in that box to try and incorporate diverse perspectives. So it's not just whoever's in the room happens to decide what goes into the monitoring program, but you're considering what do other people care about as well. So this is from the publication as well. Essentially what we did was take 6 indicators, which you'll see at the top right there, and we told them, let's try to reduce that to 5. And then we gave them a few different criteria that ultimately you don't need to read those. It's basically, is the indicator usable for reporting? Is it measurable? Can it be managed? How does it relate to threats that we're going to be facing or that we face already? And how much of a priority is it for you? And so when we had them score all of these indicators, we said to them before we released the information, which one of these indicators do you think would definitely be on the list? And the general consensus was Secchi depth would be on the list. Now, once we looked at the scores, you can see Secchi depth didn't even make the list, never mind was near the top. So it just goes to show that not necessarily these are the indicators, the criteria that you want to use, but the fact that when you use criteria to try and make decisions and incorporate different perspectives, you often get different results. For the monitoring review, at the bottom here, you'll see you'll see all of the criteria that were used for assessing the different programs that people highlighted. Don't need to focus too much on that. Essentially, the recommendations that came out of it was that we would need to recognize different knowledge approaches, especially Indigenous, because as you see here, very to the far right, almost nobody recognized Indigenous roles for knowledge. To use multiple formats of reporting, not just a watershed report card or just a scientific technical report, to clarify monitoring and management roles from the beginning. So what is it that monitoring is trying to achieve and do, and what is the expected follow-up from management that anybody involved can actually expect to see. Use water quality, quantity, and biomonitoring together where relevant to the question. Very often the biomonitoring aspect is not present at all or is lacking in some way because it is more challenging, but it is also something that completes a story if you're trying to figure out what's going on. So it should be used. And finally, to, of course, link monitoring to management and decision-making. So with the Indigenous youth engagement, we called it Grand Expressions. What we did was we invited them to create different types of artwork in various media, and we asked them to express their relationships with water, how they live their lives as it relates to water, and what the resource means to them. And along with that, we asked them to write little stories or write-ups to go along with it to explain what they're trying to depict in their artwork. So some of the artwork were accompanied by traditional teachings, some were about personal experiences, some were a combination of both. Some just talked about a news event, for example, oil spills is in the middle there. The collage is talking about an oil spill on the Grand River. So there are different things that were brought forward, but that was then used to create different recommendations for management in the framework that I'm going to be talking about or introducing shortly. And if you want to see the exhibit, it is on my website. Version 2, version 3 will be out soon, freely to use, freely to see. But we also like to support our venues. The museum in Kitchener has added it to the 3rd floor where the alarm exhibit is being hosted. So if it is something that you'd like to go see, then check us out there too. So the end result, of course, we have that goal. I'm just putting it there to remind you. We want to have a framework to consider cumulative effect. It's co-created by diverse stakeholders and connects monitoring to decision-making. The result ended up looking more like a framework for a Grand River Estuary Working Group. So it's not so much a high-level monitoring and management framework, but focused specifically on the estuary. That was where the biggest gap was. And there's potential to look at using this type of model in other estuaries across the Great Lakes, because there is not a lot being done in the estuary areas of main tributaries into the Great Lakes. There are two aspects to this, first being the framework, which is the organization of the different parties, processes, actions, etc. And then there's the process itself, which is basically the how-to guide or the steps that you would take to try and implement the framework. Process highlights include that stakeholders and rights holders define their own roles in this framework. Partnerships and collaboration are the foundation of implementation, as they often are already. But this also includes citizen science, that's a big one, partnerships with academic institutions and other community groups. And the idea here is that the community can actually fill a lot of the gap of capacity that exists right now if we're organized in an appropriate way. Integration of Western Indigenous knowledge forms. So this starts from the beginning of defining what the problem is, taking into account community observations, for example, as a way to identify a problem as opposed to this is what the data tells us. Data collection where possible. Both Western and Indigenous communities can collect scientific data that contribute to the same database for comparability. But there are also different narratives that can come out of that and different reporting styles that can be used to further engage and also affect changes in communities as well. Cumulative effects are considered using an analysis tool, and there were a few different examples through my interviews of things that people have tried. Systems mapping, Bayesian networks, and other models. There were some that seemed to work quite well and others that were kind of dependent on highly dependent on what went into them. The idea is to incorporate short and long-term data, as well as a combination of water quality, quantity, and biomonitoring data, as mentioned earlier. This was echoed multiple times by different interviewees. And this is what the basic process looks like. Now, underneath each of these steps, there are many, many little pieces. There's probably about 4 or 5 slides full of information that I could have added after each one of these steps. I won't for this presentation. I will for another one if you're interested. Before I get there. And so you'll see 2 different colors represented on this screen. So the green inside is kind of a mini process, mini cycle within the blue cycle on the outside. So you would have 1 to 2 year iterations that would pretty much be check-ins. And then you have your overall program evaluations every 3 to 5 years. Before you can get into the actual implementation of this, you would need to establish a set of principles and values, and then identify who your key players are and organize them appropriately. This is incredibly important and something that is often done very quickly and without nearly as much attention as there needs to be. So the framework itself I recommend in the context of the work that I'm doing, a 1-year design phase for collaboration and relationship building. This is heavily dependent on how closely and intensively the partners and different community members can work together. So it could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, as is sometimes the case. I think one of my interviewees told me about a program they implemented that ended up taking almost 5 years to finally really get going. And that's just because relationships are super messy and complicated. Adaptive monitoring and management cycles, as mentioned. So you've got your check-ins and your whole program reviews. The program reviews ideally would follow the turnover of provincial government as closely as possible, not necessarily entirely based upon them, but because that's where a lot of the priorities in the region come from, it would make sense to do a review and make sure that everyone's still aligned in terms of what information is being collected and what evidence needs to be used for decisions. And because you're doing those regular check-ins, having a 4 to 5 year review outside of those cycles of government would be satisfactory, because you would have all those mini interim reporting in between, so you wouldn't have to worry about missing anything. So the principles and values, these are a little bit different than, well, some of them are similar, what you would expect, but some of them are pretty different than what you would expect to see in a program like this or a framework like this. A lot of this came from engaging with community groups. And so this is one of the reasons why you would want to engage with community members, and also how you can engage with them early on to ensure that the program is guided by their perspectives without them having to actually get into the nitty-gritty of designing a monitoring program. So I'll give you a moment to just read these. They're pretty simple and straightforward, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so I hope everyone's gotten a chance to read these. This will again be sent out, so if you miss something, you will have it then. We'll quickly run through some of these steps here. First, with conceptualization, that's the high-level question: who will be involved? You will ideally include an engagement plan, a formal engagement plan, so it's not some informal, oh, we think we'll just do this. It's clearly laid out so that there's accountability. That's one of the main issues with accountability, is there's nothing to hold them to. How will people be involved? When? For how long? We recognize not everybody needs to be engaged all the time, of course, you can't do that, but there are situations in which, for example, the visioning and the principles and values, where you can incorporate a broader perspectives. Goal, scope, and deliverables, including the format of delivery. So you would ask the people, the end users, in what format they need their evidence in. So a community group might want, for example, the evidence being delivered through a workshop with the community where they can actually go in and learn how to do things themselves and how to contribute to the area. Or you would show them, well, this is what clean water looks like. This is what happens when you add this substance, for example. Something like that, right? It's very different than what we usually think of when we think of reporting on monitoring. And yet it can be very effective for getting the change that you want to see. Of course, we want to remember the principles and values when designing the scope and goals, etc. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go through the steps, that those should govern how we determine the rest of this process. With the who will be involved, leadership in this type of framework would consist of two teams. It wouldn't be by a specific organization. There would be a core planning and steering team representative of interest groups, and then a coordination team, which would be people dedicated to nothing except coordinating relationships, coordinating information, coordinating anything that needs to be coordinated. You would also have an additional person or team, depending on how big this gets, who are knowledge brokers. And these people would ideally work closely with coordination team, or depending on how big these teams are, there may be some overlap with representation on either or. And the main role of the knowledge broker is to ensure that the information that is produced gets to where it needs to go, although they would participate along the process as well to ensure that everybody's understanding each other appropriately, that there's no misunderstandings in terms of goals and strategies and things like this. Almost like a translator in a way. And then the roles would be based on self-identified preference, but also with consideration of organizational capacity and the ability to adapt to changes in priorities and processes. Because if you've got certain entities, for example, some government agencies that take on a huge portion of the work, but they are very limited by mandate to be able to change what they're doing and exceed what their scope is, perhaps they're not the best organization to take on a good chunk of what we're trying to do. It depends on the question that's being asked. Recommendations of some of these roles. This is largely from the interviews. Governments would be good for long-term monitoring and to implement political and legislative infrastructure like standards and regulations, permitting, things like this. Governments and water managers, which would include conservation authorities where they exist, would be responsible primarily for characterization and ongoing monitoring. Water managers, including CAs, conservation authorities, would primarily be focused on facilitating collaboration and public education within this framework. So they do monitor based on their mandate, but in terms of how they work with other partners in this framework, their main role would be to facilitate and to educate the public, to connect with people. Universities would be primarily responsible for short-term research on specific issues, and they also have pretty good capacity to delve into emerging phenomenon and assess efficiencies or efficacy of decisions. partly because of the lower risk environment in terms of what comes out of the work that you do. The planning stage, we have logistics, so you're looking at your timelines, budgets, things like this. You're finalizing your monitoring questions, selecting your indicators, perhaps using a process like what we looked at earlier with the criteria-based ranking in that chart from the exploratory study. Determine your monitoring protocols. Typically, these are standardized. And so what has been going on a lot over the last couple decades is there's been a lot of work put into standardizing a lot of the protocols and approaches to monitoring. And so we don't want to completely overwrite everything that's been put into place. We're not overhauling a system, but we do want to work with the system and make sure that it is used in a way that allows some flexibility. So when you do your iterative check-ins or your program evaluations, there may be times when protocols or approaches may be changed, in which case you want to have an overlap of at least a year or two, so you have a couple of seasons in there, where both protocols are used so that you can have comparability. You'll be able to translate what the new protocol and old protocol is telling you. Risks and approaches, alternative approaches would involve the process itself. So is there a risk that might prevent this framework or this program from achieving the goals that it has set out to achieve? And if so, how can we get around that? And then evaluation of how you're going to evaluate what success looks like and what those criteria are. Of course, we want to be mindful of the engagement plan. So as we're planning what's going to happen, you want to be thinking about those roles and those entities who are going to be engaged and how they're going to be engaged, and make sure that you're talking to them about your plans so that they can contribute. It seems obvious, but it's not often done. Now, a quick note, this is a really interesting point of this project, looking at how cumulative effects assessment may or may not be different than what we already do for monitoring. Of course, we recognize every effect we see out in the environment is a cumulative effect. It's never, well, rarely caused by one thing. However, the difference is in how you quantify the relationships and the interactions that occur. And so while some people have gone into this thinking that it's a completely different state of monitoring that you have to do, it is beginning to look to me, after all the work that's been going on for the last 5 years, that you can actually build one from the other. So this is an example of a drafted table. These are not perfect questions, or I'm still formulating this with my interviewees and partners, but in general, characterization monitoring would be focused on characterizing conditions in conventional monitoring, but then for cumulative effects assessment, you would be characterizing relationships. So you have similar questions, but it's what you're quantifying that is the difference, what you're measuring, sorry. And then issue-based monitoring, like deep dives or testing decisions, would quantify impacts of separate stressors for conventional approaches, or relationships among those stressors for cumulative effects assessment. And so you can see how there's a natural progression from what we've done in the past and how we can build on that to move forward and look at more complex problems. In execution, you're looking at the logistics and indicators, how you're going to actually do it, because this is the time where you actually go out and do it. You're not planning anymore. Data analysis, you want to determine the analysis that you're going to do ahead of collecting data so that you know what you're going to do with it and there's a reason for collecting it. But then, of course, once you have it, you can get into analyzing it. Reporting, again, look at the formats, who's going to be reporting to whom. Your knowledge broker is probably going to be extremely active in this phase. And then the management response after. What do we expect management to do and how can they do it? So cost benefit analyses were something that were raised by interviewees as something that should be pursued more often to ensure an efficient use of resources when we're making decisions. Regarding evaluation, we have the check-ins and program evaluation as mentioned. Basically, you're keeping tabs on everything going around you. The idea of looking outside your I'm going to call it a governance area. We can call it a watershed, but it's not always a watershed where governance is defined. You want to look at stressors from outside every now and then, just on a peripheral basis, as well as looking at what effects you're causing outside of that, that boundary, because that could be, number one, a potential to collaborate with outside parties to try and mitigate effects that you're experiencing, but also you want to make sure that what you're doing is not just impacting your community, but also not impacting other communities outside. It's just a responsibility to your neighbors type of thing. When it comes to revision, we want to base decisions based monitoring on decision maker priorities. So when you're revising the plans and reviewing everything, you want to say, okay, well, are the priorities still the same? Is what we're doing still answering those questions? These types of things. Where program changes are made, ensure comparability of data, like we mentioned a few minutes ago with the protocol. Succession planning for personnel, funding continuance, and end of program if you need to plan for it. So if you've come to the conclusion that actually we've achieved everything we set out to achieve, there's no point in trying to keep it going if there's no further goals that need to be achieved. So you want to plan, well, where's the data going to go now? Are these relationships that we've built going to be able to be used for future, and how are we going to talk to partners about that? All these kinds of questions come up. So these are some high-level challenges and lessons. Again, everything that I've just skimmed through is a really quick overview. And so there's a lot more to what went into each of those steps, but that can be left for reports if you're interested, or future presentations. You can feel free to let me know and I'll invite you into those. Ethical dilemmas came in early on. Whose ethics are being, I guess, assessed. So of course, as a university researcher, to produce information, I need to collect data, which has to undergo an ethics review. And the ethics review that most universities undergo tends to be from the perspective of the Western science ethics. And so the idea of what informed consent is, what informed means, and then what consent looks like, is not necessarily aligned with other perspectives of that. So when I'm in my context working with Indigenous communities, but this doesn't just apply to Indigenous communities, by giving them a 4-page piece of paper, for example, saying this is what it's about and this is, how you can participate, and if you want to withdraw, you can withdraw, and things like this, please sign it at the end so that we can talk. That doesn't really go over too well when you've got a colonial history where contracts have been made and not kept, and where a person coming in to try and get people to do things without building that relationship first has happened in the past and not worked out as well. So sometimes you need to go in and start getting involved and perhaps starting some of your work before you can get the informed consent that you need to quote unquote start your research. And so there's a little bit of pushback that I experienced on that. There are also historic relationships impeding current ones. Nancy mentioned the Haldeman Tract in the area. That is a big sticking point with the territories. And I think some of you may be aware of what's going on in Caledonia right now with those disputes. So the one thing that came out with how to address that is you have to be very genuine with your interest in working with the communities. Tell them what you're interested in, be honest, and make sure when you're very clear about the commitments you're going to make that you deliver on those commitments at all costs. So that could mean, well, if your study is cut short and you're halfway through and you've made a promise to that community, are you still going to deliver on that? You have to think about these kinds of things. And that would be prioritizing the relationship over the deliverables. So it's not about what I can get out of the community, it's about how we can work together to make sure that we both come out ahead. Of course, there's scoping limitations. So reciprocity in many cases is not built into the scope of most people's mandates. So there's a question around that. And then too many assumptions are often made. We don't always know as much as we think we do. So monitoring personnel often think they know what information decision makers need. And so they try to just create more and more evidence and keep presenting it until they listen, which is not always the case. And same with decision makers knowing what the monitoring personnel are going to tell them. Oh, it's just the same old stuff. I already am aware of the issue. It's not always the case. So there needs to be more communication, and a lot of interviewees actually raise the issue that people don't value that communication, so they don't see a need for it. And then to engage interested parties if they're interested. So there's a lot of times where vested interest exists, but the parties don't want to talk to you or collaborate with you. And if that is the case, then you need to ask why that is the case. Because if it is something that you can address or work on, then it's perhaps worth doing. There was another situation in the Canadian Water Resources Association conference where we did that workshop where we talked about modeling and how we input the data to model the different roles of the different, well, they're called nodes, but people, organizations that go into a model to see how management's decisions will play out, for example. And what came up was, well, if you don't actually experience that perspective, if you don't live it, you don't necessarily know how to define the roles. And when you have a model, the little people and organizations in that model can only do what you tell them they can do. So that's why it's important when you're building these things to engage with diverse stakeholders to ensure that people can define their own roles, whether it's in real life or in a model, so that you get a realistic look at what potentially can happen, good or bad. So if you want any more information about anything, there's a lot more detail to be had. You can contact me at my email. I have a research website with a resources page, and everything from presentations to reports to news articles is on there. There are some publications I've listed here. You can click this link in the presentation when you get the PDF, as well as the October 5th workshop coming up and the one in November that is still being organized, so there's no date yet. And I think that's it for me.
Great, thank you very much, Elaine. That was a really great presentation. We're going to now move to the Q&A portion. So please, as I said before, use the Q&A feature, which is not the chat box, to post your questions. That just makes it a little bit easier for us to keep track of them all. But we are interested in your output sort of generally, and how this work might be useful to your organization. And if you have any recommendations for Elaine to consider. So if you have thoughts on this, use the chat feature, or feel free to ask questions of Elaine of that nature. We're also going to have a follow-up survey in case you want to have, and that'll provide more information if you want to get in touch with her to discuss any of these things in more detail. So there have been a couple great questions come in through the Q&A. I'm going to take a quick peek at those. So the first one comes from David Sweetnam. He's wondering if there's a role for NGOs, because when you went through a list of recommendations in one of the previous slides, you were mentioning things like, here's what government should do, here's what conservation authorities could do. Do you see that non-government organizations should be part of this too, and how might they be involved?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that is an excellent opportunity for me to clarify. When I'm speaking of community groups and community members, NGOs are absolutely included in that. Generally speaking, the folks that I interviewed there were some from organizations like Trout Unlimited and Friends of the Grand River and things like that, but overall they were ministries, provincial ministries, some conservation authority, and a few from Environment Canada. Those with the dominant demographics. And so when they're talking about recommendations for roles, typically they talk about the people they generally work with, which are those groups. They don't often work with the community groups and NGOs. And so that's why that was missing from those recommendations. However, in speaking with some of those other community groups, yes, there is monitoring being done by NGOs already. I spoke to someone who did a program with the World Wildlife Fund, assessing lakes and rivers across Canada and the programs there and what was missing. And a lot of that came out to be, things like data transparency and those high level challenges. So there is information and there is capacity within NGOs that we are definitely not tapping into from a monitoring point of view. And so in this estuary group, yes, NGOs play a really big role, often in partnership with academics to try and secure a lot more funding to be able to carry out the work that needs to be done.
Great. I sort of view this next question as building on some of what you had just said. So this is from Terry Reese. He says that sampling with citizen scientists can be an effective and enduring source of sustainable field capacity. So do you have any thoughts or comments on how it helps in a practical, cost-effective way, or how it might impact or improve knowledge transfer?
Yeah, that seems like a few questions in one, but if I miss something, please remind me. So yes, I agree. And one thing that I didn't get too much into, which is actually a really big part of that part of this framework, is capacity building and the need to ensure that community groups have the capacity they need to be able to perform. So it's great if you engage with a group and say, oh, would you be interested? And we have a shared goal. Would you be interested in helping out? And they say, yeah, we want to help out. And then you say, well, we need this, 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 and this. And they say, oh, we don't have a boat. We don't have this equipment. We don't have a lab. We might have 20 people, but that's about all we can contribute at this point. And then you say, well, sorry, we need someone who has a boat and a lab and things like this, right? So, I mean, obviously conversations don't go exactly like that, but essentially that's what it's getting at. So that's where some of the partnerships with universities come in. But part of what's been proposed is that ministries will give public groups like for example, I keep using Triad Limited because that's what one of my interviews was, access to ministry laboratories, ministry equipment with training. So to have a training program for members of the public who commit to a certain duration of participation in this kind of a framework, so that there's a trade-off between, well, yes, we're offering our resources and spending resources to train people, but they are committing a certain amount of time and effort to develop this information that we want, that will then contribute to the decisions that we're making. So I don't know how much of that question was answered.
Terry, feel free to add additional questions or to the chat box if you wanted her to touch on anything more specific. For now, I'll move on. So Darian Keshman says, on the surface, this framework might seem similar to some of the existing frameworks that are out there. So what do you see as the major shifts or innovations with what you're proposing in your framework from compared to what governments or conservation authorities are already using or operating under?
Right. So that's different depending on which conservation authority and government authority that you're talking to. But overall, the way that people are organized and the way that capacity is shared and information is shared is a big difference. That is changing to some degree because Environment Canada does have its open data shift that it's kind of working towards, and as well the province of Ontario has its recent open data portal. And so in terms of access, like physical access to the information, it's becoming better. The general public still cannot generally understand what all of that data means. You can download a spreadsheet with like 2,000 data points information, but that doesn't really tell the public much. So understanding how we can improve the way we organize ourselves, improve efficiencies in the way that we communicate and share information and resources, build capacities together, and then also with the values and principles, the underlying reason and approaches that we take to accomplish the goals that already exist and the goals that people are already working towards. That is a little bit of a different perspective that may change the approaches and the protocols and the way in which we create information and share information, which hopefully steers those decisions in slightly different ways.
Great answer. We have another good question from Christopher McLeod. He's wondering a little bit more about this knowledge broker position that you were talking about. So, you know, and often some of these organizations, there's no one with the title knowledge broker. So who are these people? Like how are these positions generated? Who do they report to? Maybe you could provide a little bit more information about sort of the governance around these knowledge brokers.
Right. So that's a really good question, and I don't fully have the answer. That's part of what we're going to talk about in our October 5th meeting is what that governance would realistically look like. But the idea is that it would be a person who's, in an ideal world, specializes in knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation, and in community engagement, so that you're able to actually work with diverse perspectives, right? Because you have that understanding as a community engager. And so it's someone who is designated for that role, not someone who's part of another organization who just jumps into the role because it's convenient, or because they want to. But that being said, it's not precluding someone else from an existing organization or partner from being in that role if they have the right qualifications to be able to facilitate those relationships. So it is in theory a new role, as the person who asked the question said. That's not really a formal role that actually exists right now, but it is something that a lot of organizations and individuals are calling for, because the way that our structures are set up, especially in government, there's a chain of command that you have to go through. And I've had very senior scientists say that they can't speak to their minister, even though they have all the information, they've been at this for 30 years, because they have to go through 6 other people before it gets there, and it usually doesn't get there. So having a person who works outside of that system as a community member, being able to go in and speak to different members and build those relationships is kind of the idea there.
Thanks. And if I might just add a point, because my title is Knowledge Mobilization Specialist, I'd also suggest that a lot of NGOs play that role of knowledge mobilization as well, or knowledge brokering between different organizations, I think, which is what you were trying to get to in terms of community members playing that role and helping, because different people in different organizations have certain responsibilities, certain abilities to move, and then you know, other organizations have more flexibility, but different roles. And I think usually it's a combination of people who are involved in different projects who end up playing that role of making sure that knowledge is communicated and everyone has a common understanding.
Right, which is why it's individual or team, depending on the context, right? That was mentioned there. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Great. Another question. First of all, great presentation and thank you very much. Can you give maybe some specific examples of monitoring collaborations with communities where these strategies have been implemented?
Right, so I've actually gone into quite a bit of detail on some of that in one of those papers from the monitoring review. But a couple of different examples you might want to look into are it's the Slave Lake, what is it called? There's long names, but it's Northwest Territories and it's a Slave Lake watershed. And if you go onto the Canadian Water Network's website and look at the Water Research Consortium that they held, they had, I think it was 7 or 9 different nodes, they called them, across Canada, where they experimented with how cumulative effects could be implemented. And the one in the Slave Lake, you can follow up on with the resources that they've included there. And that was, I think that was the highest scoring program that was evaluated, because it goes heavily into engaging with the First Nations and having them conceptualize what the basis is for the program, places for positions for NGOs to contribute, as well as just plain community members, whoever comes up and says, I live there and I care about it, I'd like to contribute. There's funding that was offered by the government to the territorial government to community groups to build capacity. So that was a key component that was also included. And it was a multiple years long thing where part of the program design was dedicated to engaging with people. So it's not just, oh, these 6 months we're going to talk to people and then we're going to move forward. It was, well, we're designing all these steps, we have another crew who's dealing with all this messiness around engaging with people. So it was an ongoing thing as well.
Great, thanks. So keep the questions coming. In the meantime, I'll actually ask a question. So you know, there's obviously lessons to be learned from other community groups or other strategies. But what have you might have learned that might be unique in the Grand River Lake Erie context that might be able to be applied to other parts of Canada or, you know, other parts of the Great Lakes region?
Yeah, so the whole idea around having like a dedicated estuary working group, that idea in its own is something that I didn't come up until the very end, when I started pulling all the data together and I started realizing that's what people were kind of talking about, even though they didn't call it that in their interviews and in the consultations, which could theoretically be tied into the binational agreement work under some of the annexes, and could contribute to both binational targets as well as Environment Canada's nearshore monitoring that they've started doing with the Nutrient Initiative and other programs that they're trying to do with nearshore specifically. So something like this is a model that it's mostly the model that I'm talking about that can be replicated with obvious tweaking for each region. For areas like my exploratory study location, which was the Muskoka River watershed, there's no conservation authority there, right? So we have a conservation authority in the Grand River watershed, but in areas like that, which is much more of Ontario than areas with conservation authorities, you don't have that mediating point where you have someone who is really good at bringing partners together and engaging with the public and doing public education programs and things like this that the conservation authority does. And so the types of collaborations that we're talking about with NGOs that, like you mentioned, as well as with local institutions, and then being able to broaden capacity using community groups, for example, a cottagers association in the area, being able to mobilize locals. That is something that can be built on and that may potentially may be able to be used in those areas. But again, capacity has to be built. So if you had, I'm going to use that Cottagers Association again, come in and say, we'd like to partner with you on this, you then have to provide them with the funding and the mandate to be able to contribute back to the decisions that are being made in the area.
Yeah, and Terry actually commented again just to add to the conversation around knowledge translation and brokering. So he just wanted to clarify that from his perspective, people who are engaged in the upfront discussions about monitoring, maybe they're doing the sampling, they've bought into the program, they're connecting with the people who are receiving or translating the results, and they can actually help with some of that as well. And lake associations, like you mentioned, are vested, they're proximate, they're competent, they're trainable when it comes to this kind of work. And so in that way, NGOs really are important in this role, and government is not always the one that's making the connections between, the broader community and stakeholders. So groups like those lake associations are doing some of that work. And sometimes they need funding from groups like the conservation authorities, and sometimes they go and find their own sources of funding to be able to contribute to this.
Right, which also goes back to the point where there's so much leveraging that can be done among various organizations that is not done, partly because not everybody knows where those organizations are, or what they care about, or what interests they have in terms of how they would engage in something like this, because they've never been asked. But also, you reminded me of a point that I wanted to bring up earlier with the capacity building and the funding that you just talked about and the training. I was hoping not to have to mention COVID, because I hate that everybody talks about it, but due to COVID, everybody started doing all their university education online, all their training online, and there's a lot of accessibility in terms of how to train people and how to reach a broad group of people. So even with the massive online open courses, the MOOCs, it's possible to train broad audiences in the community without having to get, 20 different workshops with 15 different people each, and there's a huge cost associated with that. It could be simple as an online course for certain, like a lab course or something. As I taught an ecology lab course this summer, we taught people how to do stream measurements and tree measurements and everything like that from an online setting. We used virtual worlds, and they had to go and use GPS points and measure things like this, right? But technologies exist now that allow you to train fairly inexpensively and reach a broader audience. So there's not much of an excuse anymore for not engaging with community members at a larger scale to be able to build that capacity to facilitate.
Mm. So that brings up another question I have. Doing work in a collaborative way can take a lot of extra time. So if you were just going to, do things, whether it's your own sort of research for your PhD, or maybe it is developing a monitoring plan, if you were to be able to do that sort of in isolation, theoretically, you might be able to get it done quicker. You had to do tons more consultation and connect with people and workshops in order to get the perspective from lots of different people, and then think through how it all kind of comes together, and that takes time. So, what are your perspectives like? Do you think it actually took you longer to do your PhD by applying this approach? And then in comparison, then that collaborative approach would also take longer to develop a monitoring plan. Is it worth it in the end to be able to have to take that time? What's your perspective on that?
Absolutely. So to answer one of those sub questions, yeah, it definitely added probably a good year to my PhD. And that was just such a small scale of this one question that I'm asking. I'm not actually doing a monitoring program. So it would definitely add a lot more time. This is part of the reason for the coordinating team, because part of their role would be to help make sure everybody's talking to who they need to talk to and giving the right information, et cetera. So a lot of the time commitment that would be taken up by all these different people trying to do this independently could be collectively facilitated from that coordinating team. Not all of it, of course, but a lot of it could be. There was something else I was going to, if it would be feasible to implement given the time it takes to do that. There are situations, of course, where you have a question that needs to be answered by next year or in 6 months or whatever the case may be, right? And so if you need to go out and quickly get information for that, number one, there is a lot of information already out there. So in terms of characterization, that requires several seasons, years to do. Very often, we already have a basic characterization in these highly populated areas. So that's not the concern. The concern is for emerging issues and for deep dives or for testing potential decisions. Should I do A or B? Which one's better, right? That kind of a thing is something that should be applied in an iterative framework like I've mentioned here, perhaps with different timelines, in which case you could start with the collecting of the information partway through the framework. It's not necessarily linear like I've drawn it out, while also putting the other steps into place so that by the time you get to the next phase, you start having those other considerations under your belt, so to speak, and you can make those revisions and then consider a broader, whether it's different indicators you need to look at, or you start collecting data and then realize, oh, this is not actually telling us what we want it to tell us, and then start changing it up. There are times when you may need to just jump right into data collection, but you need to know that you have those other iterative steps and the other things being put into place to support you as you move forward. That's all.
Great. Yeah, those are really good points. Thank you so much. Thanks, Elaine, for your presentation today. Thank you to everyone who participated in our webinar, and also Kirsten Grant, who provided some backup support. We'd like to end this session today with one last quick poll. So if I'll ask Kirsten to bring that up. Did you learn something new that might inform your work moving forward? So a quick yes, no, or maybe you're not quite sure yet. Maybe you want to review some more materials. I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that. We'll check out the results. %73 said yes, and then a few weren't sure. So hopefully those who aren't sure will be able to review some of the follow-up materials that we're going to provide, and then, you know, have some time to digest and think about this. Elaine, if you want to move to the next slide, I just also want to quickly point out the next webinar that we have in this series. Nandita Basu is going to talk again. This time she's going to talk about sustainable urban scapes. So what's happening around nutrient cycling in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. So this is going to be on next Wednesday, September 23rd. And please feel free to go to that link or do a quick search, and you'll be able to register for that now. So like I've said a couple times, we're going to be sending you a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar and the slide deck. There's also going to be a brief survey directly following this webinar, so that'll pop up. And if you can participate, that'll be really helpful. If you want to participate in one of Elaine's follow-up presentations or workshops, you can indicate so on the survey. And filling out the survey is also going to help us improve the value of these webinars moving forward. We're also producing one-page summaries of the webinars in these series, so please keep an eye out for that. And once again, thank you very much, Elaine, for your insightful presentation. And finally, for everybody else for joining us. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.